I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And I'm Rachel Bovard.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common sense and common good meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So we've got a really fun and I think pretty diverse show for you today. So we're going to talk first about the virtue of moral courage as it pertains to the kind of ongoing saga pertaining to the Space Force. We're going to talk about kind of my wheelhouse, my bread and butter. The Supreme Court has granted cert. They've agreed to hear a more or less direct challenge to Roe versus Wade. Very exciting stuff there. Talk about the University of California school system outlawing standardized admissions tests, what it says for the war on merit. And we will finish up with why the left needs the Capitol riots as an issue to fester a little longer. But let's kick it off with the virtue of moral courage. So Rachel, you want to get us started here?
Sure. So I kind of want to talk about this in the context of cancel culture as we're sort of seeing it play out across different facets of American society. Most recently, there's actually two key examples of it. The first being the Space Force has relieved an officer of his command after comments he made on a podcast criticizing the diversity and inclusion initiatives that the military has been encouraging. So this guy, Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Lohmeyer, has written a book called Irresistible Revolution, Marxism's Goal of Conquest and the Unmaking of the American Military. Now, I want to bracket the conversation about him by saying, you know, the military does put restrictions on what active duty members can say and do, but according to Lohmeyer, he asked permission, you know, to publish this book without any overview from the military. You know, sometimes they go through and redact certain sections or have, you know, right of first refusal on certain publications. According to him, they said no. So, you know, this is Lohmeyer in his personal capacity commentating on the military. And for that, he was fired. And, you know, pair this with another recent termination of Antonio Garcia Martinez, who is very well known in Silicon Valley, former Facebook employee, wrote a book called Chaos Monkeys. A day or two after Apple hired him, knowing full well about this book, he was also terminated because of it. So Apple knew he had written this book, you know, was aware of what was in it, hired him anyway. A group of woke employees that basically went after him, and Apple folded. Now, this is actually cancel culture. I think cancel culture gets conflated a lot. You know, when public figures use it to say, you know, for instance, Senator Josh Hawley, they're not going to publish my book, that amounts to cancel culture. I think it's a little bit of a different question for public figures with major platforms, you know, who can find another publisher very easily, as opposed to what we're starting to see now, which is working class individuals being fired for not comporting with what is now sort of this woke ideology, this ruling class elite way of thinking. And I think this really goes to, you know, how we should respond to it. And I've been thinking a lot about this, the issue of courage in these contexts. And I was thinking over the weekend about, you know, the way C.S. Lewis framed the virtue of courage, you know, which is that courage is the sum of all virtues at their testing point. And I think that's very true in these cases because, you know, it takes courage to stand up for what you believe in. And the only way I think to cancel culture or to stand up against it is for individuals like this. And you're seeing this with Antonio Martinez. He's suing Apple. And I think, you know, a strong conservative movement is one that rallies around these efforts, that doesn't fold in the face of attempts at personal destruction, and really rallies behind individuals standing up against it, who resources them, who hires them in some cases, who gives them, you know, jobs when no one else will. This is the only thing I think that's going to stand up against the scourge of cancel culture as it's taking heads. And again, I really want to emphasize this at the middle and lower class. Like, this is where I think cancel culture is most insidious, is that when it goes after people who don't otherwise have a platform. And I think, again, a robust and vital conservative movement is one that will stand behind these people. So I just want to kind of throw that out to the group. As I've been thinking about ways in which to address cancel culture, it seems to harken back, I think, to the virtues that made the conservative movement strong. And we focus on our traditions. And I think moral courage is one of them. And I think in this context, it's extremely important to make these people feel, you know, strong and empowered, you know, with our support.
So Rachel just contextualized this exactly as I was thinking about it, which is, you know, And when we think about sort of the trickle down, to borrow a phrase, effect that these sort of cancel culture precedents and norms have on people that lack resources, power, money, name recognition to jump over to Substack when they can't work at the Times anymore, or have these massively successful GoFundMe accounts, you can just sort of go down the line, or just land at another job, which is what happens to a lot of people. When you start digging into how that affects people down the line, there's a chilling effect, right? And that's something that we can't even really quantify. We can sort of see in polling that people feel uncomfortable talking through issues more than they have in the past. We sort of understand all of that stuff, but we don't understand how this makes people feel as though they need to compromise their values for their paychecks, and for the sake of their family's reputation at the PTA or in the neighborhood. You shouldn't have to compromise your values to be confident that you're getting a paycheck, unless your values are legitimate white supremacy, but not, voting for Donald Trump. Those are two very different things, and that's at the heart of this, is that the left insists that white supremacy encompasses everybody to the left of, or slightly to the right of, Chomsky or Gloria Steinem. And that's a huge problem, or your average Oberlin professor. And so I think it's an important way to start thinking about it. The last thing I'll say is that this is something I think on a personal level I've been considering and mulling over more and more. It's just what is being asked of us in this moment of American history. It is not easy. It's not easy, but it's very evident what needs to be done and what we have to do. So while it is difficult and it does require a lot, we have to sort of, in this postmodern age, be confident in our worldviews and in our values and in our country, to the point that we are so confident in the virtues of the United States of America and in patriotism and in conservatism and conservative values and in our culture. We have to be so confident in the virtues of those things that we are able to comfortably articulate our confidence and articulate those virtues, and are able to take risks. And this is a moment in America where it's sort of easy for a coastal educated writer kicking back in an office to say, as I'm doing right now, it's easy, I get that. But I think we're all being asked to make really tough decisions for the sake of the country. And I don't know if that's totally sunk in with me, and probably with a lot of the public yet.
So I think Emily makes a really good point here. And, this kind of, it segues nicely into what I want to talk about here. I think and I actually feel a tinge of guilt, honestly, when we do this podcast and we kind of talk about kind of like encouraging people to stand up, that run for your local school board, a message that we preach every week. And that's the correct message. But I do almost feel a tinge of guilt from kind of like my blue checked like podcast hosting privilege, kind of preaching that about, to the deplorables in the hinterlands or whatever, right? I'm obviously speaking in colorfully metaphorical language here, but I do wonder what we in kind of like the chattering class and kind of the commentariat can like actually meaningfully do to actually kind of offer a safety net, offer kind of a robust network of support to people who are fearing for their lives, fearing cancellation. I just to kind of take like one issue that's been the news recently. We're not going to talk about it on the podcast per se, but there's been any number of sources to try to cancel people based off the latest flare up in the Middle East. I mean, I saw just kind of one story out of New York City, kind of a Jewish kind of a small merchant, grocery store owner of some sort, kind of post on social media supporting Israel, and Palestinian activists kind of went to Facebook to try and leave negative reviews, trying to effectively cancel him. I mean, I don't know necessarily what we can do to kind of support other than kind of just like grassroots kind of raise money efforts, right? Kind of like GoFundMe type situation. So this is kind of an ongoing discussion, something that I think a lot of us are going to need to think very clearly about, because there is some sort of kind of blue check privilege going on here. But the other thing, and I think this is just really important here, look, it's obviously true. I think there's a certain kind of aspect of conservatism, a certain aspect of maybe even kind of American conservatism specifically, that is thought of itself as kind of bearing witness, right? Of kind of bearing witness to certain truths, of bearing witness to kind of certain virtues and courage, kind of going back to like the founding of the modern American conservative movement, right? I think those kind of like Kirk and Buckley very much thought of themselves along those lines. But it's very difficult for this current generation, I think, of conservatives sometimes to kind of summon that moral courage when I think a lot of also, and this is kind of the other point I wanted to make here, is that a lot of the discourse, I think, in kind of right of center conservative circles is overwhelmingly negative. I think we need to basically try to do our best, especially on this podcast, to try and change that. If you kind of look around the Twitter sphere, a lot of kind of our friends, our allies, and kind of the broader national conservatism space, the new right space, whatever you want to call it, there's a lot of people are kind of harping on America. You see kind of this sentiment that seems to kind of pervade a lot that, America deserves the rise of China. We've kind of done this to ourselves with kind of decadent neoliberalism, whatever. And obviously decadent neoliberalism has been horrible. But I think if we're trying to ask our fellow conservatives to show the requisite level of moral courage to kind of bear witness like our kind of conservative forebears and ancestors have, we need to stop the negativity. We need to kind of get back to basics and talk about kind of 1776 Commission style positivism, positive optimism. So kind of just some rambling thoughts there, but hopefully it made some sense for the listeners.
Yeah, so let me address that last point. I will take the sort of negative position, but suggest that hope is not lost, because throughout history, it's always been a very small minority up against a very powerful or seemingly powerful overwhelming majority. And sometimes that overwhelming majority dominates for periods, but nothing is perpetual and set in stone. And oftentimes those in the dominant position themselves end up decadent, corrupted, stultified, and they ultimately lose. And if we look back 100 years, of course, not to go too far down the rabbit hole, but look at the Gramsciites. I mean, who even in America knew who Gramsci was in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, and even today in this country? And so the fact that a long march has proceeded just shows you the power of ideas and the power of a small, highly devoted minority. So that should harden us to some extent. On the other hand, I will say that it is amazing to step back and think about the fact that in America today, it constitutes an act of courage that you have to be courageous to promote the very values, traditions, and principles that have prevailed over Western civilization for time immemorial. I mean, that is a remarkable thing. That this is the sort of thing that used to separate us from the Soviet Union or any of a number of other leftist bastions across the world, that you did not have to toe a party line to exist in civil society. And so we should lament the fact that we are in this position today of essentially something like a communist China with American characteristics here in all too many institutions in our civil society. All that said, in terms of combating it, litigation is obviously one avenue. There need to be organizations that go out and promote the stories of those who stand against the mob. Our job as people in the media is to promote these individual stories, amplify them, because that will encourage others as well. And so I think there are some positive things that we can do on this count. Lastly, on the more narrow point regarding the military, I wholeheartedly agree with the idea that there can be no politics in the military, particularly among active members, and then even among those outside of it, especially higher level officers. They have a responsibility to be very judicious with their public remarks about political issues, I would suggest, not by law necessarily, by military code, but by practice, certainly. The problem here is that here you have an officer who is taking on an ideology which is antithetical to America, and an ideology that our enemies have harbored historically and continue to harbor today in Marxism. So it's the duty of an officer to know about ideologies that pose a threat to America and to counter those ideologies. And whether or not they should do that in the public sphere, I think is open for debate. But what does an officer make of the fact that you have the Navy promoting Ibram X. Kendi or Michelle Alexander? There is an ideology that's being imposed on members of the military, which is a leftist woke ideology. And consequently, you're going to get more responses, dissenting responses like this publicly. And so wearing your politics on your sleeves and your ideology on your sleeve in the military is a major problem, obviously. It can sow dissension within the ranks. But what are those in our armed forces to do when it's clear that you, for example, have a military which is imposing an extremism standard where apparently they're going to be potentially looking at the social media posts of members of the military? I mean, it doesn't get any more Orwellian than that. And even if, again, there's a national security reason to know what soldiers are saying while they're out in the field, obviously, the fact of the matter is that the government is imposing an ideology on the military. And that is where the focus should be first, is what does it do to our military, to our intelligence service when wokeism corrodes and corrupts it? And shouldn't we expect that there are going to be some people who are going to punch back against that rhetorically?
So, look, we're talking here about moral courage. There's possibly no issue that has required more moral courage over the past half century than the pro-life issue, I think, which is kind of a natural segue, I think, into our second segment today. So, look, there was huge news out of the United States Supreme Court this week. On Monday, after I think it was 13 weeks at least of sitting on this petition for a writ of certiorari, for a petition to hear the case of the Supreme Court finally granted the writ. So they agreed to hear the case of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which is a case out of the Fifth Circuit, the court that I clerked on a few years ago. This is a case out of the state of Mississippi. So Mississippi, basically what happened here is Mississippi passed a fairly kind of standard pro-life law. It was a fairly flat 15-week abortion ban, very limited exceptions for after that, kind of severe fetal abnormality, life of the mother, those sort of exceptions were in there. It's worth noting, actually, that Mississippi's law was actually not the strictest pro-life law that's been passed recently. We've seen 6-8-week laws. Alabama, of course, made national news in 2019 for a law that effectively abolished abortion in toto in the state. But in any event, in kind of a post Roe versus Wade, post Planned Parenthood versus Casey world, the reason that the states passed these laws is not because they expect them to be upheld necessarily in federal district court or federal courts of appeals, but the entire end game here is to kind of get the Supreme Court to hear the case. Sure enough, actually, in the Fifth Circuit, the lawyer for the state of Mississippi actually did not even request oral argument because he effectively knew, if I recall the facts correctly, that there was no way the Court of Appeals would uphold it. But nonetheless, the Supreme Court has agreed to hear this case, which is unambiguously good news for pro-lifers. In order to kind of hear a case of the Supreme Court, you need 4 justices to vote to grant the writ. So, from my perspective, what that means that you have here, and just before I get further along, it's worth noting that the exact framing of the legal question that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear is whether all pre-viability abortions are unconstitutional. That is kind of the exact legal question. Roe versus Wade, which was 1973, kind of did this trimester-based abortion framework. Planned Parenthood versus Casey came in 19 years later in 92. Basically kicked out the trimester framework, brought in the viability framework, which is more or less the so-called law of the land in abortion jurisprudence to this day. So it's difficult to kind of view what they agreed to hear here and say this is not a direct challenge to Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is, of course, the abortion law of the land. So great news here on the face of it for pro-lifers. It means really that 4 justices, because again, it takes 4 to kind of grant the case, 4 at least seem to believe that there is a reasonable to very high chance that the Roe Casey abortion regime can, at minimum, be probably undermined, at maximum overturned. The key question from my perspective, of course, is whether that will be the case 13 months from now, because the court will not hear this case until the next term, which starts in October. They usually save their kind of landmark cases for the end of the term. So the opinion we can probably fairly predict will not come out until June 2022. I think in the 13 months from now until then, we're going to see a fairly unprecedented disinformation intimidation campaign. We're going to see the White House. We're going to see Joe Biden and Kamala Harris issue statements kind of hectoring the justices, basically trying to put them in their place. It's going to be kind of a separation of powers, overreach 101 sort of thing. I think we're going to see Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi. They're going to double down on court packing threats. We'll probably see kind of the documentary filmmaking industry out of Hollywood, which will kind of come out and produce some kind of agitprop videos trying to kind of scare people into what a kind of post-Roe, post-Casey world might look like here. Now, look, as Rachel certainly knows, I feel like we've been on panels on this in the past. I am usually not an optimist when it comes to things judicial branch related here. If I'm kind of just looking at the justices here, I immediately think that John Roberts is probably a loss. So you're starting with at best 5 justices. Brett Kavanaugh, I think, is where most eyes are going to turn here. There was a very long McKay Coppins essay at the Atlantic magazine about Brett Kavanaugh, how he seems to kind of, if I'm reading between the lines there, he seems to be still seeking kind of liberal approval in the aftermath of obviously what happened to him. Amy Coney Barrett, Neil Gorsuch are not particularly tested. So I guess there's always that. So I would caution my fellow pro-lifers to get their hopes up. I think there is not a particularly huge chance for an outright overturning of the Roe Casey regime. I think there's at least a reasonable chance that the Casey kind of viability undue burden standard might be modified to allow for kind of the states to more regulate some abortions on the margin. Obviously, I hope I'm wrong. I would hope and pray for an outright overturning of Roe and Casey, but we've just been burned too many times. We've been down this road before. Of course, the other kind of elephant in the room, and I'll kind of kick it over to the panel on this. I'll probably write my column on it this week. The elephant in the room is what happens to the quote unquote legal conservative movement if a 6-3 Republican nominated court, 30 years after the last letdown in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, still can't even meaningfully undermine, if not outright overrule Casey. I think we're headed towards a genuine crisis point if that happens. I obviously hope it does not happen, but I'm curious if anyone here has any thoughts on the court agreeing to hear this case, the pressure campaign that I mentioned, maybe kind of put your prediction hats on. Just any thoughts from the panel?
Well, let me jump in and just say that I wholeheartedly agree. I have zero confidence in the court. We talk about, there's a portrayal of the court, at least when it suits the media, of being these attempted, at least, independent arbiters of all manner of controversies. But the bottom line is this: Roberts himself has shown himself to be political by saying that he doesn't want it to be a politicized institution, because that is code for not ever wanting to rock the boat on any issue of substance. I know I'm being a bit extreme in my criticism here, but Josh, as you've said, the conservative side has been burnt time and time again. And those who are considered to be safe on any number of issues oftentimes end up coming to decisions that are at loggerheads with them. So, I think my expectation is the worst, probably. Now, that said, there are some benefits to the fact that the decision that this case is being taken up. I suspect there will be some dissenting opinions that provide pathways forward for maybe some future litigation that will bear fruit and create, the precedent for at least legitimacy of certain positions that might not otherwise be out there. Obviously, there's going to be a massive political impact to this. This will probably be treated as on the ballot in states across the country going forward. But in terms of expectations for the court, I tend to have very low expectations and to take a very pessimistic view of it, again, with the caveat that there may be some good that comes out on the merits of the various opinions that result when the case is taken up.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested. Go ahead, Rachel.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I think, as Josh mentioned, my thoughts on the juristocracy are well known, maybe at this point. I don't have a tremendous amount of faith in our judges, but I think it's important to highlight how we ended up here, which is, again, the juristocracy exists because Congress just refuses to act on any of these questions. And we look to the courts constantly on these major cultural issues because Congress refuses to do anything. And I think it's interesting to watch how the left has already responded to this, because, again, they seem to have the backbone on this issue that the right lacks on every other cultural question. Because the minute that this case, it was announced that the court was going to take up this case, Jen Psaki from the White House press podium said, you know what? We support codifying Roe regardless of what the court does. And I think that is the response you will see immediately from Democrats, probably even before the court acts, but even if the court acts, in ways that they disfavor, they will immediately seek to legislatively overturn it. And that is the actual proper response from a legislature, to which responding to a court decision with which they disagree. The right does not do that. Right? We faced the Bostock decision, that terrible decision authored by Justice Gorsuch, which read gender identity and sex into the Civil Rights Act. And instead of acting legislatively, you saw, a handful of senators, sort of gnash their teeth on the Senate floor, a minority of them, and the rest were transparently relieved that the courts had made the decision for them. So I do think it's important to note how the left responds to these questions. And I don't often advocate for the right becoming the left to address certain questions, but I think in this, it's instructive. They use their legislative power to respond to the courts in ways that we have not. And I'll just respond to Josh's question about predictions. I agree with him that I don't think Justice Roberts will be the real strong advocate that we need him to be on this. Kavanaugh, I think the line from that Coppins piece was that Brett Kavanaugh cares what the New York Times thinks of him, which I think doesn't bode well for a strong stand on this case. So I suspect we won't see much of a difference here. What we'll get and what we'll have to comfort ourselves, I suppose, are strong dissents from Clarence Thomas and Amy Coney Barrett. But beyond that, I'm not quite hopeful. So I'll just leave it there.
You know, it's going to be interesting to watch a major, potentially landmark conversation about something like this play out in the culture that we're in at this moment in America. Because at the same time as you've had the advancements of science, I think creating a generation of millennials, and probably the same will be true of Gen Z, that's not uniformly pro-life, but is more pro-life than youth have been in the past. And, the advancement of science that's creating and showing, the importance of, I guess, the pro-life argument, or just the essential nature of the pro-life argument, is we can see babies formed in more detail earlier and earlier. It's going to be really interesting because the left is also at this moment where they have gone pedal to the metal on abortion rights, so-called abortion rights, when it comes to defending people like Ralph Northam, or look at what was done in Cuomo's New York. We've seen a lot of abortion extremism on this very, I guess I would say, calcified left that hasn't, let there be any room for dissent. I mean, we've seen what they've did to certain people in their own party who have, been dissenters on the life issue. So I think there's this very interesting confluence of the advancement of science and extremism on the left that could come to head in an interesting cultural way. I don't know if that'll play out politically, but I guess I'm interested to watch this case play out on a cultural level. We got a little preview of it as we saw Josh mentioned the Alabama case. We got a little preview of it then. We got a little preview of it in Georgia. Whenever the left is able to cry abortion extremism, they are able to muster all of the power of Hollywood and the corporate media to cover stories in a way that and frame abortion in the way that they want to, and the way that they believe that's helpful. I don't know how well that's working anymore. And I think this could be a big test of that.
Let me just wrap a bow on this segment real quick, and then I'll toss it right back to Emily, actually, for our third segment. But if you go back and actually look at Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which again are kind of the two court cases from 1973 and 1992 that control abortion jurisprudence, in Roe versus Wade, which obviously is an abominable opinion, I mean, up there with Dred Scott, with Plessy as among the most vile opinions ever issued by the Supreme Court, Harry Blackmun, who wrote the court majority, even said in the opinion itself that that the holding of this case is contingent upon the current understanding of embryology and the science of the unborn child and how it could eventually later change. And then even in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is 1992, the justices did talk about kind of the state's interest in protecting fetal life and protecting unborn life. That did make it into the opinion. I say that just because we are now 30 years after the latter of those cases, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Embryology, medical science, we know so much more now than we did then. And, I mean, I'm just a culture warrior at heart, but I really hope that the right, and not just kind of the justices, obviously, I'm talking about like elected Republicans, the conservative chattering class. I hope the right does not kind of shy down and let the left define this narrative. If the left actually wants to follow the science, if we actually take them at their word, which we shouldn't, of course, but if we try to take them at their purported word, especially in kind of the COVID hysteria, the science and Harry Blackmun and Roe literally now, 50 years ago kind of presaged this. The science should dictate a very different outcome. So anyway, I hope the right does not shy away from this battle, but I'll stop filibustering. We've got another great segment coming up here. So Emily, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, let's jump into a fight that is appealing to people far beyond just the right. This is a case study that will absolutely infuriate and has infuriated people across the political spectrum, and it's going to have us pulling at a thread that we've been pulling at every week for the last few weeks, which is the war on meritocracy and the war on merit in this country. The UC system, so the California University system, will no longer be considering SAT or ACT test scores in admissions. Now, a lot of schools around the country have gone to test optional models where you can submit your ACT or your SAT score if you'd like to. But in this case, California is simply no longer going to be considering those tests. That's, and by the way, this is part of a lawsuit that claimed the SAT and reliance on the SAT or ACT scores, the consideration of SAT or ACT scores was racial discrimination. That's actually a pretty racist argument. You can argue perhaps that our school system discriminates racially. Our public school system perhaps discriminates racially by not providing, this might be an argument for school choice in fact, by not providing equal education in certain low income neighborhoods versus, higher income neighborhoods, incomes in higher brackets. But at the same time, that's what we have to really think about here is this sort of soft bigotry of low expectations. It's absolutely true that the SATs and the ACTs are, are able to be gamed by people with the money to do it. That's absolutely true. The same is true of our school system. It's not a racial issue. It's a privilege issue. It's a money issue. And if that's if your beef here, if your goal to prevent racism is to actually be completely obviously glaringly reverse racist, you're not doing what you think you're doing. You're not accomplishing exactly what you think you're accomplishing. In fact, you're actually dragging everybody down in the process of accomplishing an anti-racist mission that in fact treats people of different racial groups as less capable of achieving on the SAT or the ACT. Fix the school system, fix the culture, but don't treat people like this. I'll just open the floor up to everyone else right now.
Well, I'll jump in since I have to get my couple Ibram X. Kendi references in per podcast. This is a direct quote from him. I'll say it again and again. Standardized tests have become the most effective racist weapon ever devised to objectively degrade Black minds and legally exclude their bodies. And Kendi has some kind of faux intellectual argument that he suggests backs this sort of perspective. But I think Emily laid it out correctly, and that this is the soft bigotry of low expectations. Californians themselves, I think, have at least tangentially rejected this. There was a Proposition 16, that was on the ballot recently, which was a pro-affirmative action measure, and it was rejected in California, in part due to Asian Americans in California as the biggest opponents of it. We've also seen, incidentally, Asian Americans in places like New York City punching back against the city, which is also trying to get rid of testing standards to allow kids into the elite, rigorous public schools that require testing to get into them, like a Bronx Science, for example, or Stuyvesant and the like. All of this ultimately is going to destroy our academic institutions if we don't have standards by which to grade students. And calling tests racist because of the outcomes that are perceived as disparate outcomes is simply not a legitimate, intellectually rigorous, justifiable position to take. It's not going to help anyone. In fact, it's going to punish kids who deserve to get into schools, and then it's going to put other kids in positions where they're not able to succeed or prepared to succeed. And then for those who are able to succeed, but it's assumed that they got in as a consequence of no standardized tests, out of something that might be bigotry, they are always going to have to prove themselves and have a chip on their shoulder. It goes to Clarence Thomas, for example, when he talked about the fact that he was afraid that he was considered an affirmative action case, a token, and constantly had that view, and again, that chip on his shoulder. So all around, it's horrible for the country. If you applied this to any other area, if you apply this to athletics, how do you judge someone as a baseball player? Do you judge them by their batting average, or do you judge them by some characteristic that they have no control over? Obviously, you have to judge on the basis of merit. If politics dominates, then ultimately you are going to lose and die as a country, in effect. And so I can't strongly enough emphasize how asinine these kinds of policies are and how detrimental they are to the country long term. And of course, all of our adversaries, by the way, for all of their corruption and all of the problems that they have, they understand that in certain areas, particularly strategically significant areas, you have to promote talent or ultimately you fail. And it just boggles the mind that our institutions don't care about the human lives that they are going to negatively impact as a consequence of these policies, because they think that the impetus behind them is really what matters, not the outcomes.
Yeah, I don't know how much I'll go on, Rachel.
Sorry, I can't see you guys. I think that last point that Ben made is very instructive, because whenever these policies go into place, I always have to ask, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think this is going to be some like mass equalizer? No, it's going to further balkanize education in America more than it already is, because it already is in many cases, right? You already have, I think, as Emily pointed out, rich elite parents rigging the system at some of these universities. You don't think that's still going to happen? You don't think that you're going to create a divide between resourced families who are able to, pull their kids out of schools like this, give them private, tutored education, and set them light years ahead of everybody who's stuck in public schools? This is counterintuitive to that end. And also, I think it's like policies at odds with each other, because to the point Ben made, we are constantly trying to compete with, all of these other very technically savvy cultures and countries who are outpacing us in advanced physics and, quantum mechanics and AI that requires a very special skill set. And we pour billions of dollars into STEM education for this reason. And yet here we are wiping away, any sort of education that would advance those skills, that would promote and nurture those skill sets in individuals. So I think Josh made this point a couple of episodes or last episode, that this is a policy of decadence. Only a culture that is just not serious, a culture that doesn't actually take its sovereignty seriously and that doesn't take its education seriously would do this to kids. So I'm just appalled every time it happens. It's going to have exactly the opposite effect that its proponents contend.
Yeah, I feel like we talk about the war on merit. It's kind of one of our recurring topics in this podcast, but rightfully so, because we talk about national conservatism. The name of this podcast is NatCon Squad, of course. What is there to conserve? What is a nation in the first instance if we are not trying to put ourselves out there as a unified force for good? We talk about kind of common sense and common good. Well, what is good? I mean, is good actually just kind of an intersectional, equity-based diversity whereby every single profession has to precisely mirror the sexual, religious, ethno-national, sexual, whatever breakdown of the populace? Or is good something slightly more objective? I think it was 1 or 2 podcasts ago, I went on some slightly abstruse kind of off the beaten path segment about like the objective beauty, right? I mean, going back to like the Bible and kind of ancient Greeks. I mean, and it's kind of gets into kind of body positivity, right? And kind of all sorts of that stuff nowadays. So this is just like, I mean, we are an unserious country. Unserious countries do these things. Serious civilizations that actually care about the nation state as it's always been traditionally conceived, defined in advance. Serious countries that care about any notion of the common good, that care about any notion of the good, period, do not do these sorts of things. I guess I just kind of thinking back along the lines, this ship has kind of been sailing for a little while now, right? I mean, it certainly is exacerbating a lot. It has gotten a lot worse, and I fear it's only going to continue to get worse. But we did kind of see kind of the warning signs of this sort of thing, probably as long as like 5 to 10 years ago, right? I'm thinking really specifically of kind of Larry Summers, the favorite kind of Harvard economist. I think he had some famous comment. I'm not remembering exactly what he said. He was kind of comparing, I think, like natural aptitude for men versus women and kind of the hard sciences or mathematics or something along those lines. And he got like a ton of blowback for that. Larry Summers was a top-ranking Obama White House economist. This is not kind of a right-winger, right? So this ship's been sailing for a little while. Obviously, kind of James Damore and Google. I think we saw a lot of it happen there, and that was like 4 years ago now. But look, every time a headline like this is generated, every time that, and University of California, for goodness sake, I mean, this is a massive system. Anytime something like this happens, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, they pick up the proverbial or perhaps the literal phone and they smile and they say, "Hey man, have you seen what the Americans are doing now? Ha ha ha. How silly are they? How great is this? And it's really not a very far stretch to get from that to very tangible, meaningful actions that kind of hostile actors like the Chinese Communist Party, like the Russian Federation, might take. I really don't think it is that hysterical to paint a fairly direct possible line from this sort of kind of a self-flagellating idiocy that America is doing. And then kind of Xi Jinping is way more emboldened the next week to possibly invade Hong Kong or Taiwan. I don't think that's a crazy statement at all to make. I mean, if we are unserious about advancing our best, we know that we're unserious about advancing and promoting our best in the military, in the intelligence agencies. We've seen that a lot over the past few weeks or the past few months. So none of this ends well. And it's just incumbent upon people like us who have a platform, who have this podcast, who can write and ideally kind of affect people. We have to just say in very plain, unvarnished language how astoundingly stupid this sort of stuff is. And it really, let's not sugarcoat it. It is astoundingly stupid. Rant over, we'll see what happens tomorrow. Hopefully better times.
Well, I was going to say, before we jump into our final segment, a last thought that I have is that I don't think there's anybody out there that will defend the SAT as the perfect system for measuring intelligence. I think the same thing is true when you look at other ways to measure intelligence. There's really no perfect way to do it. There's no perfect way to measure preparation for college or qualifications for college, but we have developed ways. And so it's actually heartbreaking to hear the stories of kids who go into these schools, public schools in low-income neighborhoods, who are so ill-equipped and get such mediocre educations. Mediocre might be putting it kindly, compared to what kids get, disproportionately white kids at other schools get. Absolutely, it is. But the left's impulse to deal with this by calling things like the SAT racist, or tools of racism, it's just ridiculous and unserious. And it shows how unfocused they are on the roots of so many of these problems, because they focus on the signaling. And so with that, I'll toss it over to the next segment.
Well, yeah, let me add one quick comment on that. Again, by the standards of the anti-racist who believe in creating equity in this country, it is the left's cities that have kept kids in horrible school districts that have been the racists in this. And so if you want to be an anti-racist, you need to promote school choice and vouchers and everything that breaks the stranglehold of both the politicians and their allies in the teachers unions that have ruined these school districts. Okay, that short rant over. Josh said that we were an unserious country in effect, in the way that we're acting today. Maybe not in effect, maybe in actuality. But the one thing that our ruling class is very serious about is dominating, controlling power, and ensuring that if there's an opposition, it is effectively a controlled opposition and nothing more than that. And recently there's been a legislative push to convene a January 6th commission, because there aren't enough investigations going on and hearings going on around the events of January 6th. And frankly, I don't believe this should be dealt with as a good faith sort of argument about, on the merits, should we have this commission or not? I think it's very clear that this is going to be, if it were to exist, a politicized exercise aimed at, of course, smearing, tarring, feathering, and potentially investigating, using many powers of the federal government, anyone who dissents from the ruling class's orthodoxy. Because if you look at the text of the commission bill, it goes into the impetus, or I don't believe they use the word incitement, but looking into the ideological threads that stood behind the so-called insurrection that occurred on Capitol Hill. It appears, at least, that Mitch McConnell has indicated that he will reject any such commission. And so it appears that it might be DOA at this point. But all that said, I think we ought to talk about the fact that the narrative around the Capitol riot itself on the merits is collapsing, but none of the million initiatives that it has spawned have stopped. If anything, they're only accelerating. And that's even if this commission never comes to pass. I did a very long form monologue on this on YouTube, and I'm be happy to share the URL in the show description or on screen or likewise. But I want to point out some of the things that January 6th have marked. And I don't usually like to consult notes, but just to kind of encompass the substance of all of the things that January 6th has spawned that we haven't really considered, I think, as a country. Consider this: think way back to after January 6th. There were consultations between the Speaker, Pelosi, and the Pentagon about preventing the president from accessing the nuclear codes and discharging his other duties. There was a second Kabuki impeachment, obviously, where there was a bastardized standard of incitement to violence that was put forth, which of course can have a chilling effect on dissenting speech to the ruling class's orthodoxy. There's the deplatforming of President Trump, of course, from the leftist social media companies. There was the nuking of the alternative to the leftist social media companies in Parler, which it seems is back, but we'll see. Continuing social media censorship, of course, has persisted, particularly around anything involving what else? Election integrity, which was actually what tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who peacefully made their voices heard that day were actually there to talk about the irregularities associated with the election, lost as a consequence of the so-called insurrection. There was the targeting by members of Congress of cable and satellite companies in a bid to get them to drop conservative outlets like Fox News, Newsmax, One American News, and the like. There's a continued militarization of Capitol Hill and hysterical reports about insurrections coming all over the country that have never come to pass. Obviously, this massive effort to root out extremists in the military, also in the CIA for that matter. There have been reports that the Department of Homeland Security is engaged in an effort, and I'm quoting non-conservative Matt Taibbi here, to analyze the travel patterns of right-wing suspects, expand the no-fly list to include domestic extremists, and stop such targeted customs where officials may, quote unquote, search their phones and laptops before allowing them back in country. DHS might also produce information beneficial to the CIA and the FBI by using non-governmental entities to surveil potential domestic terrorists that they themselves can't surveil domestically. We go on and on. Last but not least, recently the Department of DHS put out an initiative that indicated that there would be not just a whole of government, but a whole of society effort to counter violent extremism, that coming from our DHS. Now consider the backdrop, what this all is built on. A single event where, as we now know, one person died in the violence that day, and it was a protester. Of the several hundred people who have been arrested, most of those arrests have been essentially for glorified trespassing charges. No one to date has been charged on firearm charges, that is carrying firearms on Capitol Hill while the riot was transpiring, that is storming the building carrying guns. So the notion this was a murderous, violent, armed insurrection is challenged by those points. Also worth noting, and people did have certain weapons in some cases, but in many cases they were charged with having the weapons on them, not actually using them. And we're talking things like, at the most extreme, like a baseball bat or an axe, but also things like pepper spray, for example. Again, if you look at what the Congress is doing, and not just Congress, but actually the DOJ and beyond, they're sitting on reportedly over 14,000 hours of footage that they don't want to reveal for whatever reason. They claim for national security purposes around what actually transpired at the Capitol. So you have to ask, what would they possibly be hiding? And then there's the fate of the people who have been imprisoned and detained in Washington, D.C., who it appears, according to reports, many of them are held in solitary confinement effectively for hours at a time. The cases continue to drag on without an actual hearing, and it appears that the process is the punishment. This looks like politicized prosecution, not anything rooted in justice, and that's even heightened when you consider the non-prosecutions brought against the 1619 rioters of the past year, who, by the way, did murder around 30 people, my understanding, and created multiple $1 billion in damage, not to mention all the knock-on effects in terms of the anti-police movements and what that has done to crime in cities across the country. So consider that the narrative of an armed murderous insurrection has essentially collapsed. None of these other initiatives that it spawned have collapsed. And meanwhile, we've still never gotten a clear and concise definition of what constitutes a domestic extremist, a right-wing extremist, whatever, pick your adjective. Nor have we seen, incidentally, and this is really important, really data or analysis to back the idea that this threat justifies this pervasive response. So I just want to point out two numbers really quick that point to the fact that this is very hard to justify among our national security and intelligence apparatus. In a couple hearings, members of the House and Senate have referenced a report by the think tank CSIS on their domestic terrorism database. What that database shows, and this is according to the Washington Post, is this is considered one of the best public sources of information about domestic terrorist incidents. The definition of domestic terrorist incidents excludes many violent events, including incidents during nationwide unrest last year, that is in 2020, because CSIS analysts could not determine whether attackers had a political or ideological motive. So members of Congress are going up there and saying a disproportionate percentage of a very small number, mercifully, of domestic terrorist incidents or plots in this country are carried out by right-wing extremists, but they have essentially cooked the books definitionally because they don't include anything on the other side. And it's all bad. But again, mercifully, we're talking a very small number, and then a number that is skewed to essentially enable a witch hunt against wrong thinkers, arguably in practice. And last but not least, there's also this effort to present the military as posing a threat, an extremism threat. I looked at the CSIS brief on this, and what do the numbers show about the military? In a footnote, it says, based on the 2020 data, less than 0.4% of all active duty troops and 0.2% of all reservists were involved in domestic terrorism. So the question that I have to ask is anyone going to stand up and say or do anything about the fact that it appears the narrative on which all of this relies is collapsing, and we've never seen the data, the evidence, the justification to back it up, besides primarily this single event of which, again, the narrative is collapsing around it? There have been a few people on Capitol Hill who have spoken up about it and challenged the narrative, but I would argue, and I'd be interested to hear what others think, that it's imperative to argue against this narrative because, again, it is being used to wage essentially an intimidation campaign against anyone who gets lumped in with so-called extremists, domestic violent extremists, and smeared because of what it appears 500 people who were arrested did on the Capitol that day. I've left everyone speechless, I guess.
I'm happy to hop in there. I mean, look, I remember when January 6th happened, this is kind of done under the veneer, no more than obviously an extremely thin veneer of kind of MAGA and the MAGA movement, to the extent that term even makes sense, right? And I remember having kind of a kind of a lachrymose, very sad conversation with kind of a conservative, also kind of an editor who I'm friends with, and we were saying kind of, is this the Oklahoma City bombing equivalent for kind of national conservatism, for common good conservatism? If you recall, kind of the Oklahoma City bombing, Timothy McVeigh, and all of that. At the time, it was viewed as kind of a real dagger for kind of the limited government movement, which at that point had become more or less bipartisan. We've all kind of heard the famous Bill Clinton quote, "The era of big government is over." At first, when January 6th happened, I was kind of worried that this would become kind of the equivalent of that for this kind of slightly more kind of like nationalist, Burkean traditionalist kind of revival that those of us like us in this podcast are trying to kind of inculcate here. But I think what we've seen is something a little different than that. Certainly some people, I'm thinking of people like Alex Nauertesh, whatever his name is at Cato. So some people are definitely trying to make January 6th kind of a death knell for national common good conservatism or whatnot. But what we're really seeing kind of more generally is what Ben is getting at here, which obviously is basically is trying to kind of out anyone who can be within a 500 proverbial miles of Trump, of Trumpism, of Trumpy, of basically just the Republican Party, or anyone just kind of right and center in general here. And what it reminds me of, and I'm going to do something that I never in a million years would have ever expected to do on this podcast. I'm going to quote noted anti-Semite and Hamas-loving apologist Ilhan Omar. Ilhan Omar, a couple of years ago, there was some clip that resurfaced of her talking about 9/11, where she said some people did something. And then, the follow up to that was she was saying we're kind of all paying the results, right? And from her perspective, I guess that was Patriot Act surveillance or Afghanistan or whatever she had in mind there. I am not, lest the viewer or listener be led astray, obviously, I am not in any way comparing January 6th, 9/11. What I am saying is that the same kind of framework more or less applies. Here, some people did something, and by some people, as Ben is getting at, it's an exceedingly small percentage of the thousands of people who were there on January 6th had anything remotely resembling malicious intent. An exceedingly small, we know that. That is not disputed at this point. Anyone who is intellectually honest can say that that is the case. But because, again, some people, however small they may be, did something, they really are going to make a big stink of this for years to come. And it's going to be kind of a years-long campaign to try and delegitimize, try and silence us, silence anyone who voted for Donald Trump, silence anyone really who kind of identifies center-right in general. So again, I view this in kind of the broader context of just cancel culture. I kind of view just the January 6th commission and kind of the January 6th hyping up apparatus in general, the January 6th industrial complex, if you will. I kind of view the January 6th industrial complex just being kind of part and parcel of the ruling class's cancel culture weapon, right? It's one of their foremost weapons to try and get us to sit down and shut up. And we're basically just going to have to deal with this. It's not going to go away as an issue. But the fact that that Mitch McConnell is saying he's not going to support this commission, that's a big deal, right? I mean, when kind of like when a sitting establishmentarian, the ranks of Mitch McConnell, is even saying that this is not going to end well for people who think like me, or at least who Mitch McConnell thinks like me, that ought to be kind of a major signal for those of us to kind of perk up our ears and say, maybe this is not going to be as wholesome and genuine as Nancy Pelosi says it's going to be.
Yeah, it's definitely part of the broader effort to define everybody that is a perceived enemy of progressivism as an extremist or a violent person or a bigot or a white supremacist. And this is part of it. And I think what's so important to talk about in this issue with the commission is that this is a real threat. Like, this is an escalation. This is cancel culture on steroids, because when you have a commission like this that is actually focused on, unearthing, let's say hypothetically, unearthing something very serious, which is what, the people stormed the Capitol, absolutely, that's very serious. But what they're actually going to do is weaponize it to define and categorize normal people, as Josh said, people within 500 miles of perceived Trumpism, as bad. And they're going to, in some cases, make that criminal. There's going to be an effort at some point down the road to make that criminal. And this is a step along the way, because if you actually do believe that voting for Trump is an act of white supremacy, if you do actually believe that words like pro-Trump words or a pro-Trump vote is tantamount to violence, then of course, if you really believe that, at some point you're going to be impelled to create a mechanism that punishes it by force of law. And so I don't think that's exactly how this is congealed, but I do think that's ultimately what the left would want to do. I think half of the left is really sincere in believing that and wanting that. And then you have another half of the left that cynically weaponizes the sincere, like, social justice Oberlin mentality. But this would be a big escalation. We would see how the left would use their power. I watch MSNBC all day, every day. I like watching MSNBC. I enjoy it. I don't think they go a day without talking about January 6th, and it's currently May. So it's just constantly up on the screen when I look up from my work. So, the left definitely, there's some cynical weaponization of this, and there's some sincere progressive or bigot binary descriptions happening. But I think it's part of that broader effort to just define everybody as evil. That used to be sort of a cliche and a joke, but that's actually what's really happening now. It's, if you don't agree with the far left, you're evil.
I think the really insidious part about this, though, even goes beyond the commission itself, but what the commission represents is an effort to institutionalize everything Emily just said, right? It's no longer a viewpoint that the left holds about the right. They are trying to institutionalize it within the levers of government, and the very powerful intelligence agencies and the military agencies as well. You see this now with, DOD talking about partnering with private companies to, surveil American citizens, because they can get around Fourth Amendment concerns by doing that. You see them buying up troves of third-party app data, to supplement their bulk metadata collections. I think it was John Brennan who said, white supremacy is the greatest domestic terror threat we face, which I think is, laughable from my standpoint, given my very narrow view of what white supremacy actually is. But in their minds, to Emily's point, every Trump voter now constitutes a white supremacist. So they view it as the biggest, half the country is a domestic terrorist. And I think when you start to build that into the levers of government, when you start to, partner with corporate power that is unaccountable, right? Unaccountable in a way that government is not, government is supposed to be accountable. But when you start to really institutionalize this, you're really starting to change the way this country operates, and you are starting to punish and criminalize dissent and viewpoints in a way that we've never seen before. And that is true of so many areas of our political discourse right now. But the more the left uses, I think, our public policy and our executive branch agencies to force their views as policy, I think that's a really significant breach that we should be aware of, because you don't get those rights back. And if 9/11 taught us anything, it's that, when people act in response to what they perceive as an emergency, it changes us forever. You never go back. And that's, I think, too many on the left see this as the equivalent of, what setting up a Department of Homeland Security, but for Trump voters. And that, I think, is a very dangerous escalation.
So why don't we go around the room for final thoughts at this point? I'm happy to kind of kick us off here. A friend of mine, I'm sure of some of the other co-hosts, Dave Rioboy had a piece earlier this week at Claremont's American Mind website that really kind of made me think a lot. So Dave's piece is entitled "Build Your Own America," and the thesis. This is so Dave. I love him. He's a good friend. The thesis of his piece is basically saying that the time for trying to kind of engage with people who are not within some Overton window of reasonably agreeing with you on the issues, the time of trying to engage with them, whether you're trying to kind of hone your rhetoric skills on a Facebook comment thread, whether you're trying to kind of persuade your sister-in-law of the wrongness of her position, the time for that really is over. That we should try to be focused kind of on a slightly narrower bandwidth where kind of our effort will have a slightly higher percentage of resulting in tangible impact. So, to put that in kind of like less abstract, more concrete terms, conservatives really need to kind of get our own house in order right now. We really need to try to focus on that before we can try to stop the left in earnest. And I think this podcast and, our friendly podcast, friendly publications, a lot of us are trying to do something similar or at least along those lines. And specifically, what we have to try to do, we don't want to be alarmists, okay? We don't want, I'd like to go back to what I was saying earlier. Our goal is not necessarily to be kind of dire or pessimistic or anything like that. But we do need to be sober about the severely radicalized nature of our domestic opposition, of the political left in this country, and increasingly around the Western world in general. And what that means is kind of the phrase that gets kind of trotted around a lot that Dave uses in this American Mind piece is it is really crucial that we communicate in clear, unmistakable terms, quote unquote, what time it is. Now is just simply not the time for kind of a David Frenchist reasonableness, for kind of for like more broadly liberalism, kind of like where we're all agreeing to kind of disagree on kind of a baseline level of certain values and traditions and religious sentiments and all that. Now, the time now is to make sure that those on our side realize the threat, whether it's the war on merit that we're seeing, on this podcast with the SAT that we see basically every week, kind of rear its ugly head elsewhere, whether it's critical race theory, cancel culture. I mean, all of these issues kind of collide with one another. The left wants us out of the public square. They want us gone. They do not view this as a reasonable agree to disagree, as kind of a John Locke, John Stuart Mill kind of a friendly colloquy. That is not how they view us. That is not how they view any of this. They want us gone. They want us out. And unless until our own side agrees to kind of wake up more fully in earnest and realizes what time it is, and to kind of go back to something that Rachel says all the time, kind of goes back to our own conservative tradition and sees that our tradition does have the tools, those Clarence Thomas common carrier regulation-esque tools. We have the tools to kind of go into proverbial battle, but we first need to kind of convince our own side that it is time to deploy those tools. So those are kind of my final thoughts from this podcast.
If I could just riff on that quickly, because I think you're absolutely right. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying in the beginning segment about what a vital and robust conservative movement looks like. And I think it's one that does recognize what time it is, but one that is compelled to action. And I was reminded of this recently when I was listening to Chris Rufo actually speak at a conference I was at this week. And he was talking about, he's done a great job exposing sort of this insidious critical race theory throughout corporate America. And, he said when he was sort of ready to think about what to do about it, he went to a number of leading conservative institutions. And the two he named from the speaker stage were the Heritage Foundation and PLF, Pacific Legal Foundation. And, he said, well, when I talked to them, they were like, well, we don't really do that. We don't really sue private companies. We're more sort of like, we have niche areas of litigation, or, we sort of just write policy papers. We don't really do this. And Chris was like, okay, well, wow, these are like the leading lights of the conservative movement institutionally. What should I do? And he's like, well, I just did it myself. And I put out a call and I got 150 volunteer attorneys to start litigating these cases. And he said one of his first cases was filed by a sole practitioner, a personal injury attorney. That was the guy who stepped into the breach where, in my mind, our conservative institutions need to be. And so it kind of goes to this idea, I think, that, I think the right has become very complacent and comfortable in our ivory towers, stroking our beards, thinking heavily about these questions. And we've forgotten what time it is. And we've forgotten what it is to actually engage in the marketplace of ideas, not just with policy papers, but with action and with building in the institutions necessary to support, the people who are being shunned for doing nothing other than holding a specific viewpoint, to be able to, stand behind them and bolster them institutionally. So I think you're absolutely right. And I think that there there is a younger generation of conservatives that are built in that grain, that are trying to build the institutions to do that. But I think philosophically, there is no philosophical reason we cannot do this, that this conservative movement cannot rise to this challenge, because conservatives have always, when confronted with existential crises, fought for our traditions and recognized that true freedom and true liberty is an ordered one, and it flows from respect for custom and tradition, and preserving those values represents and preserves the liberty that we all enjoy. And so I do think there's a flashing red light for the conservative movement, and I, for one, am prepared to hold them accountable to meet that moment.
Well, let me just say, I think there's something really interesting in what Rachel just discussed. And that is, I think when you look at the case studies of people like Chris Rufo, you can see how some of these issues are mobilizing people beyond the sort of traditional conservative movement. And that speaks to how these issues are not black and white partisan, red and blue partisan. These issues are not political for a lot of people, they're cultural. And I just today learned that my high school in a small town of 2,500 in Wisconsin, in a very red county, is having issues with gender ideology. And that hits really close to home. And I think the more and more that happens, the more powerful this movement becomes, because it's no longer merely a conservative movement. These issues, the conservative movement has sort of the correct instincts and ideology on these issues, but those instincts and ideology are shared outside the conservative movement. And that makes the sort of anti-woke agenda very, very different than other aspects of the political agenda. And I always am thinking, how are we going to leave this podcast on a happy note? But I'm getting just sort of optimistic thinking about that, because as it is hitting these small towns around the country, and as it is hitting unlikely places, it's mobilizing people like the people that Chris Rufo is getting to help him. And, I know a lot of people are pessimistic about maybe the sort of neutered spirit of the public. And I share those concerns. But when you also look at some of these case studies, like what's happened with Rufo, it's amazing and it should be heartening. And there's still so much good and so much patriotism and so much common sense in this country. And I think we've seen it be mobilized to great effect in some cases. And let's hope that pattern continues.
Yeah, I think Chris Rufo is a great case study in the fact that an individual who cares deeply about an issue can go out there and make it a massive national issue and take the war on critical race theory nationwide. Returning to that theme about what time it is, and also circling back to January 6th and the commission for just a moment. The commission was empowered to investigate, and I quote here, "the influencing factors that fomented such attack on American representative democracy while engaged in a constitutional process. The commission may secure directly from any federal department or agency information, including any underlying information that may be in the possession of the intelligence community, that is necessary to enable it to carry out its purposes and functions under this act." Probably 99.9% of Americans have never heard or read those passages, but more need to understand what those passages mean. They're talking about using the full power of government to essentially pursue wrong thinkers and to chill any and all opposition. So if you don't know what time it is, I would hold those statements very closely and really take a moment to internalize what that means when you're talking about one party in Congress plus a small number of Republicans who are actually willing to endorse this sort of legislation. And I think it speaks to how dire the situation is. But then on the other hand, the fact that the other side feels that it needs to go to such lengths to impose its will on America, and that it's willing to overstep to such an egregious extent, perhaps the perverse positive response to that will be that there will be a counter reaction. And maybe wokeism, which to a large extent, as Emily points out, really cuts across traditional ideological lines, is one element of this ideological war that we're engaged in. But we have to understand, again, that the tactics our political adversaries are willing to use go so far beyond anything that has any basis in American history, in what Western civilization is supposed to be about. And I think that's very telling about the way the other side is, and it also has to inform our response to it.
All right. Well, we are way out of time here, which is funny because we always know what time it is on NatCon Squad. So, on that half-hearted joke, on behalf of Ben, Emily, and Rachel, thanks for tuning in. I'm Josh Hammer, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.